Now, for this evening's feature presentation, it always makes our hosting job here a little easier when, on the day the author is due to appear, the Washington Post style section decides to run a big favorable feature about the person and the new book, and that, of course, is what happened today for Congressman Steve Israel. For those of you who haven't read the Post piece yet, let me summarize.
No, read the whole thing.
Steve, in his first attempt at a novel, has written a really, really funny Washington parody titled The Global War on Morris. The story recounts how the U.S. government's giant counterterrorism apparatus gets focused on a hapless Long Island pharmaceutical salesman named Morris. Morris, is it Feldstein or Feldstein? However you want to pronounce it. Anyway, Morris. What seems to amaze even some of Steve's closest friends isn't how amusing the book turned out. It's how he found time to write it. For one thing, he represents a pretty demanding and far from a securely Democratic district, New York's 3rd Congressional District, which includes a chunk of Long Island as well as a small portion of Queens. Also, having served in Congress for 14 years, he's become a ranking member of the House Democratic leadership and has twice chaired the Democratic Congressional Campaign Committee. But Steve does enjoy writing and apparently has developed a knack for doing so on his cell phone, which is where he composed a good part of the book. Why a comic novel? Well, as he told the Washington Post, instead of screaming and yelling on the floor of the House when confronted by the insanity of Washington, he prefers to deal with it as parody. And we're all the more fortunate as a result. So, ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Congressman Steve Israel.
Thank you so much, Brad. Thank you so much. I appreciate it. Thank you all very much. Let's hear it for Brad and the entire staff at Politics and Prose. You know, there's this theory around the country that good old independent bookstores are a thing of the past. You come here at Politics and Prose and you realize they are not a thing of the past. They're just glorious. So thank you to Politics and Prose. Now, as a good congressman representing New York's 3rd Congressional District, I should also put in a plug for the Book Review, my local independent bookstore. I was there Monday night. I love independent bookstores, and I'm really honored that you would allow me to come in and visit with you. Is it Feldstein or Feldstein? I mean, you say Feldstein, I say Feldstein. However you want to interpret it, it's a good old Morris. The book is about Morris, and what I thought we would do is spend 5 minutes sharing with you what inspired the book, and then do 3 short 5-minute readings to give you some context, to introduce you to some characters, and then we'll open it up to whatever you want. We'll have a conversation, happy to answer any questions that you have. I have many old friends and new friends here tonight. My oldest friends know that when I was growing up in Levittown, New York, America's first suburb, I wanted to do 3 things with my life. 3 things. Number 1, I wanted to be a congressman. Number 2, I wanted to be an author. Number 3, I wanted to play center field for the New York Mets. Since I was horrible at baseball, I was able to focus on serving in Congress and writing this book. So those 2 passions of mine converged. Let me tell you what inspired the book and how it was written. I was elected in 2000, and one of the first major issues that I had to confront after 9/11 was the Bush administration's argument that we needed to take military action in Iraq. So here I was, a new member of Congress, who until that point, my idea of a top secret meeting with a major official was sitting down with the highway superintendent in Huntington, New York, to discuss paving strategies. And now I'm in these meetings, Brad, with the President of the United States, George Bush. and the Vice President of the United States, and Colin Powell, and Condi Rice, and Donald Rumsfeld, and listening to their arguments as to why we needed to go to war in Iraq. Now, when you are a new member of Congress, everything's done on the basis of seniority. We all know that. When you speak is determined by your seniority. What committees you sit on is determined by seniorities. Even where you sit is determined by seniority. And so at these meetings, because I was the lowest on the totem pole, the most junior member of Congress, I was usually seated all the way at the end of the table, as far from the president as I could get. It was kind of like my house on major holidays. I was always seated, at the junior table with the kids while all the adults had their meals. But that seating actually gave me a bird's eye view of what was happening in these meetings. So I was able to observe President Bush, and I was able to observe Vice President Cheney, the body language, the texture, the tone of these meetings. And obviously these were classified meetings, most of them. And obviously I couldn't write down what was said, but I would leave those meetings having heard some of the most, shall we say, unusual arguments, some bordering on the absurd, some heavily serious. I would leave these meetings and immediately go for my BlackBerry at the time and begin just writing my impressions of the meeting and writing certain things that I heard without disclosing anything that I cannot and would not disclose. And I had this concept. I said, my gosh, this stuff, it would make the most unbelievable book, except nobody would believe what was said. But I had this concept for a book about these meetings, except I had no story. Until August of 2006. I was a member of the House Armed Services Committee, and I was sitting on that dais. And at a particular hearing in August of 2006, a major general came to address the Armed Services Committee in open session. And during that hearing, the general had to apologize for something that went wrong in U.S. surveillance of potential terrorists. Our surveillance strategies and systems and technologies picked up a tip that a group of people in Florida were planning a violent attack on the United States. And so we began listening to these people and watching these people. These people turned out to be a group of elderly Quakers. And they weren't planning an overthrow of the United States government. They were planning to put on pink T-shirts and get oak tag signs and parade in front of a military base protesting the war in Iraq. And the general said, essentially, oops, OOOPS, which I thought was a military acronym because everything's an acronym in the military. Like, what does that stand for? Oops, what is that? What agency is that? Well, we screwed up, is what it stood for. And that's when Morris Feldstein was born, right that day. Because it occurred to me, sitting on the dais, if it happened to this group of elderly Quakers, it's got to be happening to other people. Now remember, this is before the disclosure of the NSA surveillance system. This is before anybody knew what was going on. And so that day, Morris Feldstein was born. This hapless guy in Great Neck, New York, whose entire philosophy of life is don't make waves. He's the only guy I know who, when he gets on a plane, he would never put his recliner back because that would make waves for the person in back of him. He doesn't return gifts. He lets his wife return, things at the store. His entire life is spent on three things. Sitting in his Royal Lounger 8000 in the basement, watching the New York Mets, or watching Turner Classic Movies in black and white, because that's when movies really meant something. And that's Morris Feldstein. And I began writing the story of this poor guy, who is not, I knew nothing about being elderly Quakers as a Jewish guy named Steve Israel, but I knew Morris Feldstein. I mean, we all know Morris Feldstein. And so that was the story. That's how the story was ignited. And then the story, when you read the book, you'll notice it's in chronological order. I actually have dates of when things happened. Why? Because these things actually happened. There are moments and events in the book that were real, that happened, that I integrated in the book. And so I didn't write about events in this book, events wrote the book for me. So, for example, on August 20th, we learned that another potential terrorist was stopped at an airport because he was on the do not fly list, and his name was Senator Ted Kennedy from Massachusetts. Do you remember this? That Ted Kennedy was on the do not fly list. And so there's a chapter about that in the book. I worked that in. On September 21st, 2004, just about a month later, we learned that the entire national security and homeland security establishment of the United States government was dealing with an incoming threat to our survival and security and our way of life. It was a plane heading towards the borders of this country, carrying a potential terrorist named Yusuf Islam, who we also know as Cat Stevens, who, in my view, his worst crime was actually composing the song "I Love My Dog," but didn't go beyond that. And we were actually thinking about scrambling fighters, intercepting that plane, and diverting that plane to, I believe it was Bangor, Maine. Now, that was worked into the book. I worked that in as well. And the book is a chronology that documents the excesses that we all witnessed, but at the same time, and I don't want to get too serious about this, but at the same time does try and make a point, and the point is this. We wrestle with the debate between privacy and security constantly. And it's not a new wrestling match. We did it with the Alien and Sedition Acts back in the 19th century. We have had this debate, we have had this wrestling match forever. And sometimes we go too far, and sometimes we don't go far enough. But it is a constant theme in American history. I wrestled with it myself. I supported the Patriot Act. I supported it. I still wrestle with that decision from time to time. And I thought one of the best ways to reflect on that tension and to recollect that tension was to write this book. And if I had written a current events book on the theory of privacy versus security and asked Brad to put it on his current events shelf, he would say, nah, it's not going to work. It may have been a bestseller in my house, maybe my mom's house, but nowhere else. And so I decided the most accessible way of dealing with that issue was to write this parody called The Global War on Morris. What I'd like to do is share with you 3 brief selections that will introduce you to some of the characters and some of the context. I'm going to introduce you to good old Morris Feldstein, and then I'm going to introduce you to somebody else you may have heard of, named Vice President Richard Cheney. And then I'm going to introduce you to the most nefarious character in this book, and his name is Nick. And Nick, now when I read this in a few minutes, I want you to remember, I wrote Nick before I even knew, even as a member of Congress with security clearance, that there was such a thing as an NSA surveillance system. So we begin with Morris Feldstein. This will take me about 3 minutes, this selection. But before we begin, we have to have a little pop quiz on Yiddish. You didn't think there'd be a quiz here on Politics and Prose, did you? But we have to begin. How many people know what tsuris is? Raise your hand if you know. Oh, wow. So tsuris. Tsuris is what John Boehner had yesterday at the swearing in when 22 of his members, or whatever the number was, tried to bail out on him. That's tsuris. You can even be John Boehner and have tsuris. We all have tsuris. Tsuris is trouble or woe or aggravation. The book begins with that word, tsuris. Tsuris ahead. That's what Morris Feldstein, a man who spent his entire life avoiding anxiety, danger, or tsuris, thought as he sat in his dining room. He was chewing on Kung Pao chicken from the Great Neck Mandarin Gourmet takeout. His wife, Rona, had just asked him this question. Morris, do you plan on watching the Mets tonight? He mumbled, I was planning to, unless you want to watch something else. Benson is pitching and the Mets just got him. They're playing the Braves. And now, as Rona considered his response, Morris detected the possibility of tsuris. He resumed chewing, avoiding any eye contact with Rona, and hoping that the only sound in the Feldstein dining room would be the Kung Pao sloshing between his cheeks. He hoped Rona would accept his answer with a silent affirmation rather than the clucking of her tongue against her teeth, the drumming of her fiery red fingernails against the table, or that sigh. God had implanted what Morris called Rona's guilt pipes deep within her. The sound of tsuris, like the wail of a tornado warning, the stirring of a police siren, or a wave drawing back on itself before breaking in a white foam. So that gives you a sense of poor Morris. The guy never did anything wrong, and his idea of a major problem is he wants to watch this new pitcher for the New York Mets, and Rona wants to watch Wolf Blitzer. That's the difference between them. Now, let me continue a little bit with Morris and his dilemma. Of course, Rona always wins. Morris never gets to watch the Mets because Rona is in charge of the house. Because Rona uses guilt as her weapon. And so Morris finds himself later on, the taste of Kung Pao chicken still in his mouth, watching CNN. Morris sat in the Royal Lounger 8000 viewing CNN with detached interest. It was 2004, but it could have been any year since the War on Terror was proclaimed. The same rolling crescendo of music, the unmistakable voice of James Earl Jones heralding to CNN viewers who may have forgotten that this is CNN. Then Wolf Blitzer broke the day's news. Now, this is all true. This was on August, let me make sure I have the right date. This is Sunday, August 1st, 2004. You can look it up. Then Wolf Blitzer broke the day's news. The Attorney General of the United States announcing the discovery of a terrorist plot that revealed, quote, critical intelligence in the War on Terror. And after that pronouncement, Blitzer reported that administration sources have told CNN that the Department of Homeland Security may raise the threat alert tomorrow for unnamed financial institutions in Washington and New York. Those sources cite intelligence reports suggesting a possible al-Qaeda attack. CNN is watching this story closely. We'll report on it as it unfolds right here on CNN. There was also increased fighting by a radical cleric in Iraq whose name Morris couldn't pronounce. And President Bush was expected to urge Congress to create 2 new intelligence agencies with acronyms Morris would never remember because evidently the current alphabet soup of federal agencies wasn't up to the task of protecting the homeland. And with that rosy recap of the day, Wolf Blitzer promised to be right back after some commercials about depression medications. Not a word about the Mets or their new pitcher, Chris Benson, who had just arrived in a dubious trade, thought Morris. Then it got worse. During the commercial, Rona asked, "Now, isn't this better than a baseball game?" Morris couldn't understand why anyone would frighten themselves by watching the news when the worst thing that happened in a Mets game was their relief pitching. "Yes, Rona," said Morris. Now, let's shift ahead, and I want to introduce you to Dick Cheney as I had been introduced to him. We all know Vice President Cheney. We saw him as recently as a few weeks ago after the Senate Intelligence Committee released their report on torture. You know, just when you thought it was safe, right? Just when you thought it was safe, he's back, saying, "It was so good, I'd do it all over again. That's how much I enjoyed torture. Can't wait to do that again." So I paint my own picture of Dick Cheney. I have a character in the book named Pruitt. And Pruitt is the conscience of responsibility in the Bush administration. He's the legal advisor to Secretary Ridge, the fictitious legal advisor to Homeland Security Secretary Tom Ridge. And he's the liaison between Ridge and Cheney. Now, if you read former Homeland Security Secretary Tom Ridge's book, which I picked up, he acknowledges that there was pressure on him at times. Pressure on him to raise alerts, and didn't always feel that the facts merited what he was asked to do. And so John Pruitt arrives at the White House. As soon as the gate to West Executive Drive began swinging open, John Pruitt felt the usual pain in his stomach and sighed. He was about to meet with Vice President Cheney, who would feel similar pain in his chest. That was the bond between these two men. It hurt them to see each other. Pruitt arrives in the White House. I describe what that's like. I have the privilege of entering the White House frequently, so I describe what's behind the scenes. And now Pruitt arrives in the Vice President's office. The office was smaller than the Oval Office and more functional. Cheney's guests sat close to the door. The less they saw of the office, the better. Plus couches faced each other, and a large blue Victorian chair was reserved for the Vice President. Cheney's favorite photograph from the 2000 election was prominently displayed on the mahogany table. There was President Bush, wrapping his arms around his running mate. That was the afternoon that Cheney, as head of the campaign's vice presidential search committee, announced that the search was over and he had found himself. You remember that? He was in charge of the search committee to find the vice presidential candidate. And, he kind of looked down and said, well, why not me? Why not me? Cheney looked up from the stacks of papers on his desk, then nudged his eyeglasses up the bridge of his nose. What do you have for me this morning? Pruitt says, nothing new, nothing since last night, the last time you asked, sir. Cheney's sneer seemed to dip, then clicked back to its usual place. What about that report I sent you? Now remember, this is all based on fact. What about that report I sent you? Pruitt says, the Florida threat? That one. Sir, we checked it out. Turns out it's a bunch of Quakers planning a war protest. So, says Cheney. Sir, Quakers, elderly Quakers. You know, the Quaker Meeting House, nonviolence, kumbaya, that sort of thing. They're planning a peaceful protest against the war in Iraq. Cheney says, protesting Quakers. Isn't that a contradiction in terms? Doesn't that seem suspicious to you? Put more people on them. Sir, it's a group of religious pacifists at a friend's meeting house planning a peaceful protest. We can't spy on religious... Cheney gave him the death glare, and Pruitt felt his perspiration freeze dry along the inside of his mouth. Still, while Pruitt's stomach was now grinding, he knew that the vice president's pacemaker had to be shifting gears as well. And the final reading, before we take whatever questions that you have, concerns this supercomputer named Nick. Now, you remember that great computer in 2001: A Space Odyssey, HAL? Well, they had HAL, and I have Nick. Nick is this computer. Again, before we even knew about the fact that the NSA had software and algorithms and technologies that were listening in on our phone calls and reading certain elements of our emails, I have this supercomputer named Nick, which at the time was a fantasy of mine. I'm an old Star Trek geek, and so this is kind of my nerdy Star Trek-y computer that I thought would be cool. Little did I know that I might have actually been revealing critical intelligence information because there was this thing called the NSA surveillance system. So I have this scene, and this will be my final reading, where Scooter Libby and Karl Rove are driving to the National Security Agency in Fort Meade, Maryland. They're in a White House pool car. I'll just read the opening few sentences and then skip over to Nick. Scooter Libby, and remember again, all based on news, so remember Scooter Libby's trajectory and fate. This is Tuesday, August 3rd, 2004. Scooter Libby would do almost anything for his boss, the vice president. Anything. He would fabricate and obfuscate. He would offer half-truths and untruths. He'd even go to jail, for God's sake, though he knew the prospects of such a thing was unlikely, as Cheney would always have his back. Scooter Libby was imprisoned. But sitting in the rear car of a White House pool car with Karl Rove for a long drive on the foliage-lined Baltimore-Washington Parkway, winding through the Maryland suburbs, was really testing the limits of his patience. The air conditioner fought against the heat outside, and Rove had just asked for what seemed like the 10th time, "Where are we going?" "I told you, Karl, an undisclosed location." "I know that, but where?" "If I told you where, Karl, it would be a disclosed location." "I'm senior advisor to the president," said Rove. "You can tell me." "Well, I'm chief of staff to the vice president, and I can't tell you." "I've told you before, Scooter, senior advisor to the president outranks chief of staff to the vice president, technically." That was the big debate in the administration. In the labyrinth staffing structure that Cheney built, who outranked whom. Now they arrive at the NSA. Car it's reminiscent of that scene in All the President's Men, when the car is, in this mysterious dark parking garage. It's going down all these levels and levels and levels, and they finally arrive. They go into an elevator. Libby produces a fob before there was any such thing as fobs. The elevator takes him. It descends. It's going deeper and deeper and deeper and deeper into the earth, and then the elevator door opens. They were in one of those underground, undisclosed, undercover outposts of a Cheney-inspired project called COG, Continuity of Government. Here is where the vice president would be whisked to ensure the survival of the government if the White House fell under attack. On the other hand, his boss, the president, would stay at home, at the White House under attack. It was a small suite with all the essentials of a standard bunker: sleeping quarters, food rations, emergency communications equipment. Knowing he might need to spend weeks or months writing out the survival of the United States, Cheney added a few personal comforts: the entire works of Rush Limbaugh, his favorite hunting rifle, and a list of major Republican National Committee donors who would be prioritized in any search and rescue operations as the nation emerged from its apocalypse. Libby led Rove through a narrow corridor that led to another locked door posted with a sign that said "Restricted Cog Level 1. "This is what the vice president wanted you to see," Libby said. He fished through his pocket for a plastic card, which he waved in front of the door to the sound of soft buzzing. They entered a massive room, brilliantly lit and frigidly air-conditioned. Rove saw endless rows of giant cubes encased in glass and metal. Glittering black walls of computers whirled and blinked red and green lights. Technicians dressed in black uniforms strolled casually down narrow alleys, stopping occasionally to inspect a cube as if price-checking at the supermarket. Rove didn't think he was in a top-secret, undisclosed location of the vice president in 2004, but on the mothership of some alien fleet. "What is this?" Rove asked. "It's the vice president's reorganization of the intelligence community. His name is NIC. Stands for Network-Centric Total Information Collection, Integration, Synthesis, Assessment, Dissemination, and Deployment System." Right there, deep in the bowels of the NSA, where no one would notice, Nick noticed everyone's business. So clandestine that even President Bush couldn't be briefed on it. You couldn't find Nick in any federal budget, unless you had the fortitude and the magnifying glass to find a 3-point italicized typeface entry within the supporting projections tabs of the Department of Agriculture, Office of the Deputy Secretary for Public Nutrition, Office of the Assistant Deputy Secretary for National School Lunch Programs, Division of Compliance, Assistance to State and Local Governments, Education and Outreach Miscellaneous. The leadership of Congress was vaguely informed about Nick, just enough of a dose so that they would feel as if they were in the know without knowing anything at all. The last thing the country needed was one of those pesky federal judges deciding that the constitutional right to privacy was more important than the nation's need for security. Nick was one of the most potent defenses in America's anti-terrorist arsenal, programmed to follow tens of millions of lives in real time, assessing patterns of behavior and predicting against threats to the nation. Nick was the ultimate voyeur, with an insatiable curiosity and a ravenous appetite for data. He would hunt it, sniff it, taste it, chew it, swirl it around his hard drive, and digest it. And if it left a bad taste, creating the slightest irritation, indigestion, or queasiness, Nick would spit it right out in an alert to dozens of law enforcement agencies. Final paragraph on this. And this, I think, captures the mood that America was in 2004. Nick performed investigative triage in a country on threat overload. Everyone was either suspicious or a suspect, a patriot or a Democrat. America was a population of tipsters, snitches, and informants. The limitless American vision that had built a continent, forged a democracy, defeated the Nazis, peered through the blackness of space and landed a man on the moon, was now reduced to peeking through window shades and checking over shoulders for Muslims in our midst. And if you think about it, that was where we were in 2004. I'll make a final point, then we'll open it up to your questions. Brad was kind enough to talk about today's profile in the style section of the Washington Post, and I am upset with him for only reading a part of it. I would have been happy just sitting there having you read the entire thing. I can't tell you, when I wrote this book, it was partly a release, partly of a reflection. I had no idea. First of all, I didn't even think it would be published. It was published because of a fortuitous circumstance, a coincidence. I literally stumbled into a literary agency. And even when my agent took it, I said, well, there's no way that this is going to get published. And then Simon & Schuster published it. And even when Simon & Schuster accepted it and the House Ethics Committee approved it, I said to myself, well, Mom will buy it, and maybe a few other people will buy it. And it's done quite well. Rob Reiner, who made one of the greatest movies I ever made for me, actually, Spinal Tap, gives you a sense of my sense of humor. I'm in talks with Rob Reiner because he read the book and has an interest in developing it as a television miniseries. I met with him. How cool is this? I get to meet with the president in the White House. Get to fly on Air Force One, get to meet with kings and queens, and prime ministers and defense ministers. But let me tell you, sitting with Mike Stivic was pretty cool. And, we were talking about the creative process, and he said, well, for television, we may have to change it a little bit. Might have a different appeal. So what if we do this? What if we do that? Would you be okay with this? Would you be okay with that? And finally I said, excuse me, you're Rob Reiner. I'm okay with whatever you want to do. I mean, I'll figure out what to do about ISIL and ISIS, and you figure out what to do with this book for television. So I'm having conversations with Rob Reiner. The Washington Post book review several weeks ago gave it a very favorable review. I was very gratified. Being in the same review with somebody like Carl Hiaasen was one of the great thrills for me. We were at and I hesitate to say this at an independent bookstore because my loyalties are to independent bookstores, but I will tell you that there is a fairly popular, without mentioning names, there's a fairly popular online bookseller that ranks sales, and several days ago I learned that we were listed as the best-selling book, category, humor, subcategory, the law and the courts, subcategory, by members of Congress who are Jewish and live on Long Island. And so it was great. Thank you all very much. I appreciate your interest in the book. Thank you. All right. Brad, shall we take some questions? Okay.
Good evening. Thank you for being here.
Thank you, sir.
In the article this morning, there was a reference to your father's thinking about Dick Cheney.
Yes.
Could you tell us a little bit about that?
Sure.
I know you can't tell everything, probably, but...
Yeah. No, not without a therapist with me. The question was the dedication. I dedicated the book to Vice President Dick Cheney and to my father, who didn't particularly care for the man. That's the dedication. My dad was just a hardcore Democrat. I lost him 2 years ago to lung cancer. And we lost him in August before the election, the presidential election. And until literally his dying day, he would say, I'm gonna stay alive to know that Barack Obama got back in. I mean, literally, he said that. I'm going to keep going until I know that President Obama was reelected. I mean, he was hardcore. So hardcore that when I would do television, and I did a lot of Fox News, I mean, to the consternation of some here, to the contentment of others, I leaned to the right on national security issues. I leaned to the left on social issues, economic issues. And I was a frequent guest on Fox. And I mean, I'm telling you, whenever I would go on Fox, within a minute after leaving camera, I would get an angry email from my father. Why do you go on that channel? Why are you doing that? And even when I go on other stations, I didn't raise you to be a conservative. I'm like, Dad, I just talked about the importance of electing Democrats. No, you should have been even stronger. So that was my dad. My dad, my mom still lives in Phoenix, Arizona. My dad lived there. My dad in 2008 walked out. They live in a very conservative retirement community. I mean, all right, Phoenix, retirement. It goes to say conservative. And my dad would walk around with this cap in 2004 that said, "Dump Bush," with this baseball. And he would call me and he'd say, "I had a great day. Like 4 people tried to fight me today." I'm like, "Dad, that's not a great day. That's a dangerous day. Don't do that." And then in 2008, he would call and he'd say, "You know what's happening? Instead of giving me the finger, they want to shake my hand. I mean, something's happening in this country." So that was my dad. And I was talking to my mom tonight. I was telling her that I was coming here, which is why I'm late coming here, being on the phone with my Jewish mom. And she said, Dad is he's chuckling up there. He's chuckling up there about the book. Yeah. Sir.
Well, your dad's obviously a subversive.
Yeah. Right.
As I recall, since you mentioned Levittown, isn't that where Bill Griffith, the creator of Zippy, is from?
I don't know. It could be. But Levittown is where Bill O'Reilly, grew up near Levittown. We have quite a few celebrities coming out of Levittown. I went to a high school, General Douglas MacArthur High School, in a community that years before I went to that high school, it actually had book burnings. There were book burnings in my community. I believe that the Board of Education might have considered Senator Joseph McCarthy High School, but then decided, it was cheaper to do General Douglas MacArthur. Hi.
Hi. I was wondering, with your mix of real events and fictional events and news stories and actual people, how many lawyers did you and your publisher have to keep busy for this?
Well, let me say this. If I'm ever missing for more than 3 days, call Dick Cheney. And that's the first. It's a wonderful question. So the publisher, Simon & Schuster, assigned a lawyer to this who read every word. Most of the lawyer's concerns were the typical concerns that any author would have or lawyer would have with an author in terms of naming places, any kind of potential infringement, protecting the publisher and me from any lawsuits. There were several occasions where they said, are you sure you can, talk about this? And since there's nothing in this book that in any way, shape, or form comes remotely close to anything that I heard that shouldn't report, there's no problem. Dick Cheney, he's a public figure. I'm a public figure. And you know what? Washington has to learn to laugh at itself because the rest of the world, the rest of the country laughs at us. So we have to learn to laugh at ourselves. But there were no issues with respect to lawyers and the briefings and the meetings that I went to. Now, we have a very rigorous ethics process in the House of Representatives. So those lawyers, that was different because members of Congress aren't permitted to accept advances. We have to be very scrupulous, dot every I, cross every T, to ensure that we're not violating any of the House ethics rules. And that was a separate legal process that was very long and, as it should be, very detailed. Sir.
Thank you, Congressman. I'm also Jewish from New York, so
Oh.
I was also on the phone with my mother. I almost missed this because of it.
You understand it?
Exactly.
Sure, our mothers know each other.
Yeah, I'm sure they do.
Yeah.
Westchester, not Long Island, though, so.
Yeah. Same accent.
Yeah, right.
Coffee.
Westchester.
Yeah. Good. Starbucks.
Horrible kind of
Yeah.
stuff.
It's horrible. Right.
My question is, with the new administration, have you noticed large-scale changes with the programs because of that?
What a
Or
great
now
question.
it's much more transparent? Or am I hearing the news wrong? How would you comment on that?
With the exception of the issue of Guantanamo, I haven't noticed large-scale changes in approach on issues like surveillance. In fact, there's a quote in the book by President Obama. Of course, I couldn't ascribe it to President Obama because he wasn't president in 2004. But there's a scene in the book. It's in that scene where Scooter Libby and Cheney are dealing. Well, let me read it to you, because the quote actually is from President Obama. I was at a meeting, an event with him, where he said this, and I wrote it down. This is after he learns all about Nick. Rove blew a long whistle from his lips and asked, "What's to stop this from spying on innocent Americans? Accidentally, I mean." Libby exhaled impatiently. "We take privacy rights very seriously. We have checks and balances, safeguards. This government does not spy on the American people." President Obama said that. And he said it a few months ago, responding to a question about the NSA. Other questions? Comments? Criticisms? Very good. Brad, any?
But you got another book in the works, I understand.
Yes, I do.
Tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah. So before I finished the contract with, or before I submitted my final manuscript to Simon & Schuster, I had another idea for a book, which Simon & Schuster has accepted. It's now going through that ethics committee process, so there's no contract until the ethics committee says there is. The second novel is similar to this. It's a parody of Washington, D.C., tentatively entitled Big Guns. And it is a parody of the gun debate here in Washington. And it's set in two places. The first premise is that a very conservative House of Representatives with a Republican majority and U.S. Senate with a Republican majority passes a law that mandates that every American must own a gun. Under the logical premise that if Obamacare was health insurance, if you were required to have health insurance, you should be required to have life insurance. And that's a gun. So it's the debate inside the Congress about, well, in fact, that's part of the debate because there's an amendment that allows for presidential waivers of the gun ownership requirement for children under the age of 7. and people on the do not fly list. And you'll be surprised on what happens to that debate. Because once you say that children under 7 shouldn't be required, well, then why not say 5 or 4 or 3? And before you know it, I'm sorry, not 7, but 8 or 9 or 10. And before you know it, nobody will be required to own a gun. So that's in there. So you've got this crazy Congress in Washington that is passing legislation that the president will sign, requiring that every American must own a gun. And meanwhile, in a small town on eastern Long Island, you have a very liberal, progressive mayor of this tiny little, very luxurious, elegant town near the Hamptons, where you have a mayor who is passing a local ordinance that bans all guns from within her village. And so it's the interplay between this small town mayor who wants all guns banned and this national effort to require that all Americans must own a gun. I'm about 40,000 words into it, and like the global war on Morris, it's all written on this. Every word is written on this because the nature of my life and my service in Congress doesn't allow me to find time in front of a computer to write. And so I'll have an idea and start writing it on this, or I'll hear something or see something, write it on this. My staff thinks I'm the most unfriendly boss that they could work for, because whenever I'm with them, when we're in cars, on planes, on trains, or actually I was on 2 planes and a train trying to get down here during the snow for swearing-in day, all I'm doing is pecking at this. So I apologize to my staff, but now they know what I was doing. I wasn't writing mean things about them. 40,000 words into big guns. If the Ethics Committee approves the contract, it should be published in about 1.5 years. Sir.
Subsidies for guns for the poor?
Yes, it's all there. So the question was, do we have subsidies for guns for the? Yes, there's tax credits for poor people who can't afford a gun. There's tax credits for gun makers to make sure that they can make the guns. There's new research and development grants to make sure that we're making the best guns. There's everything that you would expect in a bill like this. I'm sorry? Yeah, I mean, every gun maker in America has something in this bill. It's kind of as I say in the book, a loaded Christmas tree, but loaded in a different sense of the word, perhaps. Any final questions or comments? Yes.
And do you always type into your iPhone, or do you sometimes dictate into it?
It's funny you should ask that, because you know Paul Reiser? People know Paul Reiser, great comedian. I think one of the funniest guys around. He's a friend of mine, and in fact, he has a blurb in the book. He read the Washington Post story today, and he said, "Did you dictate this thing, or did you really use your thumbs?" I said, left thumb, right thumb. I'm bipartisan, left and right. But no, it was all done with my fingers. Now, in fairness, I would work on a passage, sometimes a paragraph, for weeks, sometimes a sentence for days, and keep going back to it again, and stay on this, until I was satisfied, and then I would email it to myself, and created a whole compilation of chapters. At the end of the process, I used a laptop to do the final editing. But the first draft of everything was done on this. Everything was edited on this until we got to the final draft. Mostly because I never really believed that the thing was going to be published. I figured, well, why do I need to, spend time? I just never saw myself as, an author who was going to be published, who needed lots of technologies, and I didn't have the quiet time that an author needs, because when you're a member of Congress, there's no such thing as quiet, particularly in this Congress, where there's a lot of screaming and yelling. Sure.
I see that you have an iPhone 6.
Yes.
What's your opinion of it?
Oh, I don't know if I'm allowed to endorse products on C-SPAN. You know what? I'll give it this endorsement. If you're going to write a book, this is a really good product to write a book on. Sir.
Sir, it's a delight to hear you tonight.
Thank you.
It's always nice to hear an accomplished novelist now.
Thank you.
It's hard to believe that you didn't have weren't a wordsmith in college or earlier.
Yeah.
Could you Could
Sure.
you say something about
Well,
that?
I was quite serious when I told you that I had 3 life ambitions. I wasn't kidding about that. I wanted to play outfield for the Mets, except I couldn't pitch, and I couldn't bat, and I couldn't catch, so that was not going to happen. I always wanted to be a writer, always. I started writing in 4th grade, stories, and I loved writing science fiction. I've done 2 books that were published before this, both anthologies of great speeches, where I did short introductions of those speeches and a preface. My staff will tell you, as a member of Congress, I do all my own speeches, all my own stuff. I write my own, with the exception of constituent mail, where I have a legislative correspondent. Everything that my office puts out in my name, I write. It is a therapy. I do a twice a month column for Huffington Post called, my last one was called Kings of the Hill. It's satire, parody of what we're going through on the Hill. I've been published in the New Yorker. And Shouts and Murmurs. I did a piece during the shutdown and the fiscal cliff debate. So writing has always been, and I'm serious about this. It is a true release. Look, some people in any tough job, I don't care. It's not, forget being a member of Congress. In any tough job, in your jobs, Brad's work, his staff, you got to have a release. Some people have yoga. Some people go to the gym. Some people are like Morris and will watch an old black and white movie or the Mets. My release was always just writing, and it was always very therapeutic and a salvation, actually.
Well, I think so long as you continue to rely on Congress for your material.
I got a lot to work with. That's right.
Well, thank you so much.
Thank you all very much. Thank you so much. And let's thank Brad again and the staff at Politics and Prose.